How many of you have heard about the Permian High School in Texas? Well, it has nothing to do with the Permian period, it's just the name. The Permian period was an important time in our history because of the animals and the plants and the great mass extinction. Now I'm going to talk about some of the history of the Permian period. It began 299 million years ago and ended 251 million years ago. It was the last period in the Paleozoic era. I got this quote off of the Geological Time Scale website. The Permian was a great time of changes and life on Earth was never the same again. The Permian period was divided into 3 epochs, and at the end of the period, the Great Mass Extinction happened. During the Great Mass Extinction, 90 to 95% of life went extinct. The mainly vegetation was the ferns, and mainly reptiles lived in the ferns. The reptiles turned into the mammals, and during the Permian period, Pangea was slowly moving apart and the climate was changing. Now that you know a little bit about what happened during the Permian period, we're going to talk about the land.
Okay, so during the Permian time period, Pangea was still there. The ocean in the center of Pangea was the Paleotethys Ocean, and the continents all were generally what they are shaped like today, except for Asia and Europe, because they were spread out along the eastern side. And the continents were uplifted, but some of them were covered a little bit by some of the Paleotethys Ocean. But as they began to uplift, then the ocean began to run off. And since most of the water was in the oceans around Pangea, it was very dry in the center, and it was mainly deserts, but there was also glaciers along the southern part in the beginning of the period, and up here by Siberia in the later time. And since there was not much water, the climate was very hot during the day. It could get over 100 degrees, and very cold at night. It was well below 0 degrees at night. And since there was a lack of water, the fluctuations in the temperature were very great because the water, it changes its temperature slowly, so it helps moderate the temperature a lot. And now that you know about the land and the climate, Ethan will talk about how it affects the animals.
Okay. The Permian time period was the first period that animals had 4 chambers in their heart. One of the animals I'd like to talk about is the Dino-Gorgon. The Dino-Gorgon lived during the late time of the Permian period, and they can grow up to be 6 to 10 feet long, and they could weigh about 200 to 300 pounds. They typically have a large skull, and they look very cat-like and act like that too. Their meal consisted of mostly reptiles and other mammals. Another animal I'd like to talk about is Dimetrodon. The Dimetrodon lived during the early time of the Permian period, and they have both mammal and reptile characteristics. They grow up to be 6 feet long, and their meal consisted of reptiles and other mammals also. They are the largest dominant carnivore in the Permian time period. They have a sail on their back, right here, which is believed to absorb heat from the sun, which in turn heats their body and blood. But they were killed by the extinction. Animals were not the only thing that were affected by the extinction, though. Plants were too. One of the species I'm going to talk about is the ferns. The ferns had a great ability to survive because they could recuperate from being trampled over by larger animals. They survived the extinction, and many species of the ferns are still alive today. They began to evolve into gymnosperms, which are alive today also. Conifers are the most familiar gymnosperms today, and they also evolved from the ferns. The seeds from the conifers are formed on scales of a cone structure, and they provide food and shelter for animals around the ecosystem. They are located on evergreen trees. Another species I'd like to talk about is the ginkgo tree. The ginkgo tree is different from ferns and conifers, and they are the oldest species of trees that are known to humans. They can grow up to be 65 feet tall and 50 to 20 feet wide, and they are one of the few plants that survived the mass extinction. Now I'm going to talk about the mass extinction. 90 to 95% of all the species that lived during this time period were wiped out because of this extinction. There was more marine life killed than terrestrial life. Some theories about this is volcanic eruptions and ash, and that the ash clouded the sky and the sun, so then in turn the sun could not give the plants energy to provide food, which in turn the animals could not get their food either, so then they died. Another theory is meteors and asteroids.
This is just a video about an asteroid hitting the Earth and what would happen generally when it impacted. And as you can see, it's very destructive, and it destroyed most of the life on Earth. And now that you know some of the theories about how the extinction happened, you can decide for yourself what really happened, but take into consideration what we told you about the land and the climate, the animals and the plants, and all how it affected the extinction.